the invitation. It's great to be here. This is, I'm embarrassed to say, my first trip to Peterborough. I'm constantly nearby. I met my wife, who is Bangladeshi, studying at Cambridge University, where the ANC sent me. I was at a college called King's College. You might know the chapel, which is a very famous choir. So my wife and I, to this day, are the only couple in the almost 800-year history of the chapel to be married there, when neither of us were Christian. So my daughter is studying there now. She's in her third year at King's College. And her first night there, the guy who married us, who was then the chaplain, who is now the dean, which makes him the boss, I think, came up to her, and she has a double-barrel surname, my wife's and mine. Came up to her and he said, "This is very impertinent of me, but I think I might have married your parents." And she said, "Yes, you did." So, in December, it was our 30th wedding anniversary, and my daughter organized that we went and had drinks with him and had dinner overlooking the chapel. And I'm very embarrassed because I didn't realize how close Peterborough is to Cambridge. I only realized that today as I was driving here. So it's lovely to be here. And it's great to see so many of you here. Because as Nelson Mandela said, Palestine is the moral issue of our time. And my goodness, do we feel that today? And we've heard and seen the horrors that are being perpetrated, and this is just from the perspective of health workers that we've seen. The situation for all of those innocent human beings who are already living in the world's largest open-air prison is something I never expected to see in my life. To give you the context of why I've seen what I thought were horrific crimes against humanity, I'm going to give you a little bit about my personal background. So, as you can probably hear from my slightly weird accent, I'm not from round here. I was born in South Africa, in Cape Town. Both my parents are Jewish. My father was South African, and my mother was Austrian. She survived the Holocaust as a Jew in occupied Vienna. And the only way she survived was by being hidden in a coal cellar below their house for 3.5 years. And whenever the Gestapo or the SS were nearby, she was rolled up into a carpet. The carpet was put up against the wall and coal was piled against it in case they managed to get into the cellar, which they never did. I took my children to see it when they were 10 and 14, I think. And there are actual bullets in the steel door. They tried to shoot out the lock, but never succeeded. She lost dozens of her family, primarily but not exclusively in Auschwitz, where I've lectured on genocide prevention for the Auschwitz Institute. So how do I come to work on issues like genocide? Well, my mother taught us that never again, which was intoned after the horrors of the Holocaust, never again wasn't just about Jews. It wasn't just about white people. As my daughter says to me whenever I tell her that I was defined as white under apartheid in South Africa, she looks at me and she says, "But you're not white, you're pink." And I say, "Yeah, but you know, white sounded better than pink, so they just called us all white." She said, never again was for every single human being. And we lived in a society in apartheid South Africa where if Simone, my wife, and I had tried to have a relationship then, it would have been illegal. We wouldn't have been allowed to live in the same area because different areas were designated for different race groups. We wouldn't have been able to sit on the same public bench together because all public amenities were designated for different race groups. But the true absurdity of the system is reflected in the fact that it would have been illegal for us to be alone in a car together. I mean, what did they think was going to happen? That this was the system we lived under. And because of my mother's own experience, once she met my father in London, they went back to South Africa together. She became very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle through an organization called the Black Sash, which was predominantly white women who would protest at busy intersections against the worst iniquities of the apartheid system. So I grew up with a very, very strong sense of racism. And I'll never forget, when I was 8 or 9, my mom drove an old Mini, not the new fancy ones, the original ones. And she would take 5 or 6 of my school friends to football practice twice a week, because it was about a half an hour walk, and we were too lazy. And one day when I was about 8 or 9, we were trying to shove a couple of extra mates into the car, and one of the boys said, "You know how you get 12 Jews into a Mini? You put a half-cent piece on the back seat." And my mother was furious. She told this boy, his name was Gavin, to get lost. He wasn't going in her car. And she never wanted to have anything to do with him again. And I said to her that evening when I got home from football practice, I said, "Mom, why were you so cross with Gavin?" And she said, "Well, this assumption that all Jews, all they're interested in is money. And that's what his supposed joke was about." And that was my first experience of anti-Semitism. I experienced it again, but in the meantime, to get to when I experienced it again, I have to explain. So I grew up, my mother worked as a puppeteer in an illegal theater called the People's Space. And during my school holidays, I would have to go and spend my days at this theater. And it was illegal because it was non-racial. So I met some of the country's most famous political actors, a guy called John Carney, a chap called Winston and Chawner, who were the most extraordinary human beings. Musicians, a guy by the name of Abdullah Ibrahim, if any of you are interested in jazz. And who before he converted to Islam, was known as Dollar Brand. He lived locally, and he used to practice there. And these are the people I grew up with. So I never quite understood or accepted why whites, even kids, would call a black person, an old black person, boy or girl. And why at sunset all of these people would disappear and there'd only be white people in my white group area. So in my late teens, I was involved in a welfare agency in Cape Town that some people here know, that worked in squatter settlements and so-called townships. And in 1986, the apartheid state burned down a huge squatter camp called Crossroads. 70,000 shacks were just burned to the ground. About 178 people were killed. Fortunately, most people weren't there. 70,000 families lost the very meager possessions that they had. And during that time, I was recruited into the ANC underground. The ANC was a banned illegal organization. Nelson Mandela and our fellow leaders were either on Robben Island in prison, or they were in exile. But because my family and I, we used to spend quite a bit of time in Austria, unlike most white South Africans who were all privileged and uninterested in talking politics because they benefited from the system of apartheid, I'd heard about the ANC and about Nelson Mandela. I'd heard words of his, which if you were caught with them in South Africa, you could go to jail for 10 years. And so I got involved with the ANC, and in 1986 I had to very suddenly leave the country to avoid my military service because I wasn't prepared to serve in the apartheid military. And because, and I've never known whether this was true or not, somebody said that I was about to be arrested. And so I got out of the country somewhat surreptitiously. And the night I left, I went up a little hill called Signal Hill that overlooks Cape Town and the sea, and you can see Robben Island and Table Mountain. And I thought to myself, I will never be able to set foot in the country of my birth again. Remember that story, because I'm going to come back to it. So, I spent years outside the country. When the ANC was unbanned, I could return to the country. And I worked as a facilitator in the constitutional negotiations before being a candidate for parliament in our first democratic elections in 1994. And I became an ANC member of parliament. So I served under Mandela during his first term, and then under his successor, Thabo Mbeki, who I had a huge disagreement with, because in a country that had no enemies and that was facing huge socio-economic challenges, he decided to spend $10 billion on weapons. Weapons that we had no need of and that we've never used until today. Why? Because $350 million of bribes were paid. Cabinet ministers, senior officials, the head of our defense force, to various intermediaries and various corporate executives. And my committee was the Financial Oversight Committee, something called the Public Accounts Committee, so I tried to investigate it. And the president, who I'd known since I left South Africa in '86, because he was in exile, called me in and basically said to me, you've got a choice. You can close down your investigation and have a very successful political career for as long as you want, or you can try and continue in your investigation and we'll kick you out of parliament. So I continued the investigation, got all the information that I could, published a book called After the Party about it, and the night before they were going to force me out of parliament, I left and came here for 2 years to write that book, and 22 years later I'm still here. I have a small organization called Shadow World Investigations, and we investigate, write books about and make documentary films about the global arms trade, how it corrupts our politics, the effect that militarism has on the world, and also a phenomenon called state capture, which is an extreme form of corruption. But of course, if you work on militarism, you have to focus on Israel, because Israel lies at the center of the global arms trade. It acts as the research and development laboratory for the American, the British, and the Western European arms industry. And where does it test its weapons? In the occupied territory. It uses weapons that are illegal in all those other countries, but which are manufactured in those countries, and tests them on Palestinians, and then has arms fairs immediately afterwards, one of which I managed to go to before I published my first book on the arms trade, and now I can't get into any of them, where you don't even know where the arms fair is. You meet at a certain place in the world, and I was one of few, I was there as a journalist, and there are generals and senior politicians from all over the world, and then you all get taken to a secret place where they show you all of this weaponry, and they show you actual footage, videos of supposed targets being killed by drones, because Israel is also at the forefront of drone technology. And it's awful, and it's horrific. And I come from a tradition of Judaism, which is the tradition I grew up in, which is the tradition of never again, which is the tradition that caused a minority, but a significant minority of South Africa's Jewish community to be absolutely central to our struggle against apartheid. And people in the world forget that when Nelson Mandela went on trial for treason, the prosecutor was a Jew, because the mainstream Jewish community supported apartheid. And Percy Utah, the Jewish prosecutor, called for the death penalty against Nelson Mandela and his fellow treason trialists, 13 of whom were Jewish white South Africans, people who are icons of our struggle. So, when the BBC shows you the chief rabbi of South Africa saying that South Africa's submission to the International Court of Justice is an anti-Semitic screed and a blood libel, bear in mind that the chief rabbinate and the conservative Jewish community, organized through something called the Jewish Board of Deputies, just like here, the first time they ever mildly criticized apartheid was in 1985, almost 40 years after the worst legislated form of apartheid was introduced after the Second World War by a group of actual Nazis who had been imprisoned in South Africa during the war because they belonged to a Nazi-supporting militia. And one of our prime ministers, B.J. Vorster, who was probably the worst of the Nazis, I'll never forget in 1976 when we first got television in South Africa, we were a bit behind the times, sitting with my mother and watching B.J. Vorster, who was this odious, disgusting human being, who'd had a white trade unionist who worked underground for the ANC. They had him thrown out of the 10th floor window of police headquarters in central Johannesburg, a building called Vorster Square. This same man gets welcomed with full state honors in Israel. And he goes to Yad Vashem, the memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, and he pays his respects. But this is an unreconstructed Nazi. And then he meets with the Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and they do a deal that results in both Israel and South Africa becoming nuclear powers. There's long, long history between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. And my mother says to me, yeah, that's because Israel will befriend anybody who doesn't criticize them. So a couple of years ago, on the 6th of January, where some crazy people occupied the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., there was one guy standing there with a T-shirt that read, 6 million was not enough, meaning the Jews who'd been killed in Auschwitz, and a picture of Auschwitz. And then there's another crazy standing next to him holding up the Israeli flag. And they don't think there's any contradiction between them. That is the madness of the moment that we experience now. So, when we look at the genocide that is being perpetrated in Gaza since the 7th of October, and on the 7th of October, as a human being, I felt such sadness, such horror at what happened in Israel. But at the same time, while watching that, I couldn't help but remind myself that this isn't an unprovoked incident, as our media have tried to tell us it is. 75 years of brutal occupation, a 30-year blockade of Gaza.
Thank you.
If that's not provocation, then I don't know what is. But at the same time, in terms of international law, which I spend a lot of time working with because of the work I do on conflict and the arms trade, an occupying power cannot justify its behavior inside the territory it's occupying in the name of self-defense. It cannot defend itself against its own brutal occupation. And what we have seen since then, which according to South Africa's submission to the ICJ, is seeing on average 247 people killed every day. 48 of whom are women. 117 of whom are children. So even if self-defense was legal in terms of international law in an occupied territory, How can you claim self-defense in killing newborn babies, young children, innocent civilians, people living with disabilities of various sorts, the captive population? It is a war crime to wreak collective punishment against an entire population for an action that was carried out by anybody, including political representatives of some of those people. And what we have seen in Gaza is collective punishment, is ethnic cleansing. And as South Africa's case at the ICJ argued brilliantly in one of the most compelling legal arguments I have ever read in my life, is genocide. And as so many Jews and others have said, one Holocaust doesn't justify another. But in Palestine, as so many of you know, we have already had at least one Holocaust. Because the state of Israel, just like apartheid South Africa, which was a settler colonial project, apartheid South Africa, when the first white people arrived at the southern tip of Africa, they also tried to pretend there was no one there. What was a little bit strange about that is they kept on having to fight wars. So if there was no one there, how come they had to fight wars? Who were they fighting these wars against? The indigenous people who lived there for many, many years before they turned up. And the same thing is true in Palestine. You cannot, and you must understand that because of my family's history, I can comprehend why Jews after the Second World War wanted somewhere they thought would be a safe haven. I understand that. I just happen not to believe that the creation of a Jewish state is necessarily the creation of a safe haven. And I fail to understand how the creation of a Jewish state, quite literally, on the bodies of the Palestinian people, can be a safe haven for anyone. So one can never understand the state of Israel outside of the context of the Nakba. And we are witnessing before our eyes the first ever genocide in global history that we are watching in real time. Which, by the way, is the main reason that Israel and our governments who enable it are not going to get away with it. But we cannot allow what is happening to continue in the name of the Holocaust, in the name of any other suffering. And I, as a Jew, and we as Jews, because of our thousands of years of suffering, should be at the forefront of calling out the genocide that we are witnessing in Gaza. Instead, we have Britain's chief rabbi making some of the most appalling, warmongering, bloodthirsty statements that I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot, in defense of what Israel is doing. But let me explain to you why it is so important and symbolic that it was South Africa that brought the case of genocide against Israel. Because as I mentioned, apartheid Israel and apartheid South Africa have a long and sordid history. But there's another history between the majority of South Africans and the Palestinian people, where our struggles have been intertwined. I remember from the earliest days that I got involved with the ANC, hearing about our fraternal struggle with the Palestinian people. One of the first global leaders to speak to our democratic parliament after 1994 was Yasser Arafat. Because our bonds, our links with the PLO were so profound. So because our struggles are so closely intertwined, it is symbolic that it was South Africa that brought the case, but also because with the help of the world, including, I'm sure, some of the older people sitting here, and because of the courage and the fortitude of the majority of South Africa's people, just like we are seeing amongst Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank today, we overcame an incredibly powerful system of racist, apartheid, colonial settler rule. There was something Thursday, 10 or so days ago, seeing the South African legal team giving their argument, where you needed to understand and acknowledge that some of these lawyers who under apartheid were defined as an Indian woman, so had to live in an Indian group area, and as a black African man, so had to live in a black African area. These extraordinary lawyers were the oppressed. And today, they're amongst the world's leading legal practitioners. We have some of the world's most esteemed judges in South Africa who were once the oppressed. Because ultimately, just like in Palestine, the oppressed will rise, and they will forevermore seek justice and accountability, not only for what happened to them, but for what happens to all humanity who face injustice and slaughter. So what happens now? The International Court of Justice may be able to find a technicality to find against South Africa's case. They might. I'm not a lawyer. But if they do, we know that it will be because of extraordinary pressure brought to bear on those judges by particularly the United States of America, on Israel's instructions, the United Kingdom, and most, not all, but most of the countries of Western Europe, including Germany. I think, and I hope, that it's unlikely. Because if that happens, the rule of any semblance of international law is dead. And then the next time anybody wants to bomb central London or Peterborough, wants to conduct an attack against innocent civilians anywhere in the so-called Western world, we won't have a leg to stand on. Because we would have allowed it in plain sight. So if that happens, we have to mobilize like we have never mobilized before. And I'm going to give you some indications of what that might look like. What I'm hoping will happen is that the court will recommend a number of interim measures on Israel while it takes what will be years to finally decide whether it is a genocide or not. Now, those interim measures could be everything from telling them to stop bombing hospitals, or stop bombing, in addition to hospitals, places of residence, places of worship, schools, etc. It could be that Israel has to withdraw entirely from Gaza and the occupied territories. We know that Israel will not follow whatever the instruction from the highest court in the world is. We we know that for a fact? Why do we know that? Because just as we know they're committing a genocide to rid Gaza of Palestinians, we know it because they keep on telling us. And it was extremely embarrassing watching their lawyers, who weren't even able to keep their papers in the right numerical order, because their lawyers were having to lie, were having to obfuscate, and were having to ignore everything that their political and military leaders say virtually hourly. And Benjamin Netanyahu told us 3 days ago that it doesn't matter what the court or the UN or anyone else finds, they're continuing this war for as long as they want to. And in his case, he wants to endlessly, because when that war ends, his political career is over. And even if it wasn't for the war in Gaza, he is facing so many charges of corruption that he will likely spend the rest of his days in prison. Most of them, by the way, to do with arms deals with Germany. What the UN General Assembly can then do is it can decide to either suspend Israel from the General Assembly, or it can decide to expel Israel completely. And there would be a majority to do either, despite enormous pressure from the so-called West. Now, none of those actions are going to stop what is happening in Gaza. But what they will do is they will make it so much more difficult for our bought, cowardly, mendacious political leaders not only to continue to provide Israel with the diplomatic and political cover to continue doing what they're doing, but it will make it much more difficult for them to continue to supply the weapons that Israel needs to continue to keep killing Palestinians. Because I don't know if you're aware, and if you're not, look on a media site called Declassified UK that I serve on the board of, which is brilliant on British foreign, defense, and intelligence policy. Because what is happening at the moment is that planes are taking off every day from the RAF base in Cyprus. And the government, which is completely unaccountable to any of us, will not answer a question in Parliament about what is on those planes. So the likelihood is that what is on those planes are spare parts from the jets that drop the bombs and the missiles, and the actual bombs and missiles that are being used to kill Palestinians every day. So while Joe Biden, and I have to be honest with you, I'm not convinced the man is still alive. I mean, if you see him try to get a sentence out at this point, it shows just how pathetic, corrupted, and bought our politics has become. That the next American election is going to be between someone who might well not be alive and someone with so little brain power as Donald Trump, who probably shouldn't be alive. If we look at the Israeli leadership talking of politicians, you know, the Minister of National Security in any functioning country would be in jail for life. Why? Because when the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, it was fellow Israeli Jews who created the environment for him to be assassinated. And Ben Gvir was the loudest amongst them. He stole a religious ornament from Rabin's car, and he said on television, "Today we take things from Rabin's car. Tomorrow we take Rabin." 3 days later, he was dead. Netanyahu marched in front of a huge crowd carrying a a coffin with Rabin's name on it. the week before he was assassinated. These people who should be in jail are now the most important cabinet ministers in this country that has the arrogance, the mendacity and the stupidity to proclaim itself the only democracy in the Middle East. It has never been a democracy since the day it was thought about. And having said that, let me remind you that as long as there has been Zionism, political and intellectual thought amongst Jews, which has been for hundreds and hundreds of years the desire for a Jewish state, which is a political, ideological position, not a religious position. But as long as there has been that thought, so too has there been anti-Zionism. And one should never forget that. One should never forget that the Jewish community anywhere in the world, like any other community, has so many different opinions and views. You know, there's that old cliche joke about you put two Jewish people in a telephone box together, they'll have 12 opinions, and they'll have 24 fights about them. Because that is the reality. And that's one of the things that I love about Jewish history, is the constant contestation. But today, whether you are Jewish or not, if you say anything critical of the state of Israel or of Zionism, you're immediately labeled an anti-Semite. Now, one of the other things I did when I got to Parliament in South Africa was I discovered that the Holocaust had never been discussed in the history of the South African Parliament. So I introduced the first ever motion on the Holocaust. All of the Holocaust survivors who were still alive in South Africa and able to travel were brought to Parliament for that debate. When I raise criticism of Israel on social media, I get sent a notice of investigation by the Labour Party, which is led by my own constituency MP, somebody by the name of Keir Starmer. So I wrote back to Keir Starmer, this is over 2 years ago, and I said to him, if the choice is between living out the anti-racism that I was taught by Nelson Mandela and my friend and political mentor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, giving that up in order to be able to adopt what Martin Ford, KC, in a report that you, Keir Starmer, commissioned by him, describes as a hierarchy of racism, where anti-Semitism is somehow more important than Islamophobia, or anti-black racism, or various forms of gender discrimination. If that's the choice I have, then I really don't want to be a member of your party. I'm still waiting. But this is what is being done to defend Israel. And why do we think Keir Starmer is going to such lengths to defend Israel, even though it's costing him electoral support? We see that the vast majority of Muslims in the United Kingdom who have historically supported the Labour Party will not vote for a Labour candidate at the next election. And they're quite right not to do so. Why is he doing it? Well,
make it so unelectable.
I assume it has something to do with something else.
Money.
I assume it might just have something to do with the fact that a fellow South African who lives in the UK like me, a chap called Gary Lubner, whose father, Bertie Lubner, who I knew quite well, made billions in South Africa out of the apartheid regime.
Furniture company.
Yeah, and plate glass. And plate glass. That Gary Lubner has given Keir Starmer's Labour Party the biggest ever individual donation in the history of the party and maybe in the history of British politics. He gave him £5 million. What? And why?
Sorry.
Is that because Gary Lubner is a democratic socialist and is really fond of the Labour Party? Well, actually not. Gary Lubner left South Africa because he didn't really want to live under a democratic government. He has no political interests. His only interest is Israel. So Keir Starmer will not call for a ceasefire until the people who are bankrolling his party tell him he can. So, like many parts of the Western world today, we have the best democracy money can buy. So what do? If the ICJ either finds against